I had before ChatGPT, the two actors with the highest centrality in the network were already Alphabet and Microsoft. And actually, Microsoft is sitting inside the clusters that are mostly integrated by Chinese organizations, including Chinese big tech. So these companies are not only at the center of the frontier research agenda and therefore influencing the whole research agenda of all the people that are not participating in these conferences, but still, because this is a frontier, we'll be looking at what's going on there. But also, in the case of Microsoft, it plays a critical geopolitical role. And one could argue that because they are participating in these conferences, they're sharing knowledge. But what they do is strategically decide what knowledge they share and how. They are not disclosing the content of the models or the data that they use to train them. And actually, a way to proxy in an incomplete way, but still proxy, the extent to which they do what I describe as a knowledge predatory practice is to compare the share of co-authored publications with the share of co-owned patents. In this case, for Microsoft. Between 2012 and 2021, almost 9 out of 10 scientific publications that had at least one co-author coming from Microsoft had at least one other co-author coming from another organization. Whereas when it comes to sharing the ownership of patents, only 1% of the patents that were granted to Microsoft were shared with an organization that wasn't Microsoft. They operate in similar ways with open source and the open source community, but I don't have time to explain you that now. You can ask me in the Q&A. I want to focus on another thing that has made the headlines lately, in particular because of the case of OpenAI and Microsoft. OpenAI is formally an independent company, but it still wouldn't exist without the large investments that came from Microsoft. And those investments were not simply investments that contributed to expand Microsoft cloud business and the use of the infrastructure, but also Microsoft got a say in the type of technology that OpenAI was developing. I spoke not so long ago to Mistral AI scientists who defined this strategy as a double dip, because the companies can at the same time get access, privileged access to startups' technologies, while at the same time they steer the technology. And OpenAI and Microsoft didn't have a sort of like extraordinary deal. It was quite extraordinary in the money, and of course there are some of these agreements that make the headlines because they involve billions of dollars. But when it comes to looking at the number of AI startups that are receiving money, that have among their most important investors large tech companies, you can clearly see here on this table how important they are. This is the ranking of the most important funders of AI startups by February 2024. And you can, of course, see venture capital firms like Y Combinator, but you can also see Google, Microsoft, Intel, and so on. This practice is extended not only to AI startups, but also to other companies that are participating in what can be broadly described as the tech value chains, AI value chains, and so on. And just to add an additional ingredient here, when it comes to reinforcing the core, these companies are also quite open at establishing strong strategic agreements among themselves. And a sign of this is the recent agreement between NVIDIA and Intel, where NVIDIA purchased 10% or put $5 billion in Intel common stock. But all this, if we need to really go to what's the network of the network, why is it that organizations coming from academia, also startups, even big companies, even big European companies like SAP become dependent? Even startups coming from China, DeepSeek, has become dependent. This is the cloud. And the cloud is not only infrastructure as a service, it's not only a place where companies and organizations, also universities like mine, governments and individuals can store their data or process an AI model. The cloud is like the Tesco of digital technologies. Every digital technology can be purchased as a service on the cloud. The difference is that you can never leave the cloud. I purchase a bottle of water at Tesco, and then I leave Tesco and start drinking it whenever and wherever I want. And also the bottle was produced in a different place, not inside a Tesco, clearly. Whereas when it comes to digital technologies, the cloud is more than just a marketplace, like Amazon.com. Amazon Web Services, so Amazon's cloud marketplace, is a place where digital technologies are produced, exchanged, and consumed. And the same happens also with Microsoft and Google. Together, these three companies concentrate around 65% of the global cloud computing market. This means that they are ultimately concentrating that percentage of the stack, because all the different pieces of the digital technologies then come together, are fitted like a puzzle inside their clouds. And it's these companies that decide even what type of technology governments are adopting and how. The UK government in particular has been very open at becoming dependent on these companies. You just need to read the news of today. And one of the big problems is that when you use all these technologies, unless they are in open source, you use without access. So you become dependent, your code, the list of algorithms and the different code that you're developing gets intersected by services that you cannot control. And then you need to continue renting if you want your organization to continue in business. So in this context, even big companies become dependent. And this is just an example, and I can then go back and give you the details because I've written a paper about this case in particular, but even big European companies become dependent on technologies that they use without access. They become dependent in strategic agreements with big or giant cloud players like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google in order to control those that are further below, to capture value, organize the value chains, and also control workers. So the result of this way of controlling beyond ownership is an extended form of, on the one hand side, intangible extractivism. You discussed earlier about data. It's not just data that is being captured. Knowledge, public knowledge that was paid with taxpayers' money also end up captured by these companies. For many, they are perceived as the largest innovators. They are the largest organizations in terms of capturing, even robbing, appropriating knowledge that was co-produced by many. Of course, I'm not saying that they don't participate as well, that they are not doing research and development inside their R&D laboratories. Of course they are, but they wouldn't exist without all the research that has been funded by the public sector in many countries around the world, not only in the US, let alone, for instance, here in the UK. And then there is another question here, because it's not just about redistributing the gains, because it was collectively produced, but it's also about what type of AI we're getting. The fact that these companies are the ones deciding the research agenda, that they are deciding the type of technology that startups are developing, that are deciding what is the AI that governments and therefore citizens should adopt, is what I describe as a form of epistemic totalitarianism, where we are seeing AI in every single dish in our life. So if we think about what's the role of countries like the UK, of the UK government, I think that this really needs to be presented as a crossroads. First of all, because in principle, these should be territories that are sovereign. But when it comes to making decisions, it becomes more and more clear that both the US government and US big tech are governing beyond borders. And the fact that they govern beyond borders has already had direct effects. Here, for instance, Trump is clearly saying, if you try to regulate American tech companies, there will be retaliatory measures. And we've seen this already, and I will go there to show you first the retaliatory measures. We've seen this already in peripheral countries like Cambodia and Malaysia, but we've also seen it in the EU with the decision to water down the AI Act, to postpone the enforcement of the AI Act. So in the end, and here I will finish so that we can discuss collectively what can be done so that I keep it short and we have some space for questions. I think that what we are now, I think that we are basically in front of a trilemma. On the one hand side, governments want sovereignty, and there are a lot of discussions about the meaning of sovereignty, because sovereignty today doesn't mean territory, doesn't mean that because the data center is installed here, it will be sovereign in any way, and I can further unpack this later on if you want. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that if it comes from a British company, things will be different or better. As I was showing you for the case of Siemens, which is a German company, is completely entangled and dependent and relies on this structure of power and control beyond ownership. So what does sovereignty mean? For me, it means more democracy, rethinking democracy, self-government, and how one can find with governments, but also with civil society, with scholars and others, a way to expand democracy when it comes to deciding what type of technology we have, how it's developed, who gets access, and all this also connected to data. But this is not the only question to answer. It would have been way easier. The fact is that this is a trilemma because governments are also trapped by the need to show economic growth, and this country is an example of that. And there is an exaggerated promise around AI that AI will solve every problem on Earth, and in particular that AI will unleash a lot of economic growth. The truth is that there are at least second thoughts about that, and we should really put into question whether all this promise will deliver or not. But at the same time, while accepting the promise, for instance, embracing more big tech company investments here in the UK, there is not only a problem of sovereignty, but also a problem of worsening the ecological crisis, given the ecological footprint of these technologies and the fact that they are being developed without any regulation or control. So I leave you here, and I think that these are the questions that we should be finding more places to discuss. It's not just a matter of discussing, it's also a matter of thinking that these are decisions that are already being made by those in power and that we are not invited to the table. Thank you. And I think we have questions, but I don't know how that will be moderated. Maybe you can ask them, and if you have some.
Thank you very much. I think the sovereignty debate, it started with Chinese. They talk about China-based sovereignty, because I come to paper on that. Then it moved to EU, but when EU talk about digital sovereignty, actually they mean the independence. So probably very echo to the sovereignty you just mentioned now. It's from the individual level, community level, even the state level, but more about the independence, economical independence, technology independence. So my question is, we already talk about geopolitical power, corporate power. So this is reality, and the UK, as we had discussion with our colleague, we're a middle power country. So if that is the case, do you have any suggestions to resolve, especially for country like the UK, which is a middle power country? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Shall we gather a few more? And then, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I was curious if how the way that you've defined epistemic totalitarianism, if that also encompasses physical infrastructure. So thinking about the rollout of data centers and subsea cables as an example that these big kind of tech cloud hyperscaler companies are developing and owning. So I'm curious of how that fits in, if at all. Thank you.
And there, yeah.
Hi, thank you. Just two quick comments. Maria Farrell, an Irish sort of journalist, gave a really interesting presentation on rewilding the internet, which covered similar themes. So if you've not seen that, it would be worth a look. It'd be quite complimentary. And also on your study of where there are areas of concentration, you might also want to look at some of the international standards, because there's a heavy concentration of authorship standards by many of the same companies that you've found as authoring papers.
Sure. Maybe we start with this one. Standards, absolutely. Actually, I have a PhD student looking at standards at the moment as a form of intellectual monopolization. If I have more time and if I have, let's say, an academic audience, I will describe this as a form of intellectual monopolization. The networks have corporate innovation systems and a few other things. But yes, absolutely. And I know the work of Maria Farrell, actually, also. But anyway, thank you. Absolutely. I would connect the part of data centers to epistemic totalitarianism to the fact that this AI, an AI that requires more and more extraction of data, more data centers, and therefore more energy, more water, is part of, and therefore the huge, massive installation of data centers, is the AI that is profitable for these companies, basically because it's an AI that can be applied to many more things. Before, the machine learning models had specific uses. As a technique, AI could still be perceived as a general purpose technology, but you still needed different models. You couldn't use a model that does a fraud detection to operate as a search engine. Whereas now, the generative AI, in principle, is being sold as something that you can use for almost whatever you want. So I definitely think that this is the type of model that the companies want, also because they see a business out of it. On the cloud, they are selling the same services again and again, and when it comes to software as a service, the cost of producing doesn't increase, doesn't duplicate because you sell two instead of one. Actually, they go down because it's the same lines of code that are sold again and again, but the price doesn't go down. So basically, most of what they are capturing is an intellectual rent. And this type of AI that they are developing is an AI that does what I would describe as a form of twin extractivism also, because it reinforces data extractivism and intangibles extractivism more openly, but also through the data centers, worsens the ecological crisis and extract more nature. It's not just, of course, energy and water, but it's also about the materials that are needed to install the data centers. And then there are multiple discussions about sovereignty. I want to pick up on your term of independence, because today's world is very much interdependent. So the way in which with different colleagues we've been thinking about reclaiming digital sovereignty, and I wrote with many others a report about that, and then I wrote for the S&D MEPs another report on a progressive roadmap for digital sovereignty. I emphasize all the time that this is not techno-nationalism, not only because it will not work, but also because this is not the type of technology that we should be advocating for ecological reasons, because knowledge, knowledge basically is the only product that is at the same time input and output. We produce knowledge with knowledge. So when we share knowledge, we expand also the total common knowledge if we keep it open. So actually there are many reasons why we could think of the need to share or to work together towards an effort that expands digital sovereignty as a form of democracy that doesn't imply I have this and I'm not sharing it with you. I'm going to lead this race. I'm going to lead the race within Europe. There are even islands in Central America that say that they want to lead the AI race inside Central America. Really, at this moment in time, we should be thinking more and more about how we can work together, what type of AI is really worthwhile developing, what problems can be solved with other technologies, and which problems actually don't need more technology, but need more political discussions and economic and political commitment, because there is also a risk of techno-solutionism. So for me, the solution comes from identifying in the whole network, in the whole stack, where the key bottlenecks are, and the cloud, but not the cloud exclusively as infrastructure, but the cloud as this virtual space where the technologies are co-produced, exchanged, shared, and consumed is what needs to be replaced with a public solution. And public doesn't mean owned by a particular government. And we need to also fight for the meaning of public and what type of institutional arrangements should be developed to make sure that the governance of this potential public cloud really is public and is really a place where digital services, digital technologies can be co-developed, shared, exchanged, and so on. Because I know this is very complex and would require a lot of money, not necessarily complex from the technical standpoint. Honestly, the complexity is on the political side. But what we are also focusing on is such a solution for the public sector. So if private companies want to be completely sold on the cloud of big tech, okay, in the end of the day, it's their decision. But the public sector shouldn't depend on these companies, and especially the public sector outside the US or outside China when it comes to Chinese big tech. And if we want to actually go further down, we can say, okay, let's start with one sector in particular. And the one we've been discussing with colleagues and with some MEPs as well is education, which is very interesting because this is one of the things that Starmer has given as a gift to Google DeepMind today. I really think that we need to have an alternative ecosystem of technologies that are thought not only by Google, but broadly by, again, not only experts, let's say experts from the public sector, computer scientists, but also experts in education, in the social, ecological, economic, and ethical implications of digital technologies, and that are developed together with teachers and their unions and with parents to see really what are the technologies that the schools need and what's the investment that should be done to make this happen. So I think it's a bit of changing the order in which things are done instead of just pursuing the promise and saying, okay, we invest in AI, we buy what these companies are telling us, and we want more and more AI. Let's start thinking about the problems concretely, what the problems are, and to what extent AI is the best solution or not. If we have time, sure. They have questions.
Thanks so much. That was a very dynamic discussion. I really appreciated it. And I feel like this is the kind of conversation that a space like this is really ideal for. It's not for us, with all due respect, to be brainstorming the problems of AI ethics, but to be brainstorming solutions. And I think your proposal for a kind of a global cloud commons is a really interesting one because it raises so many challenges about financing, governance, especially at a moment when multilateralism is so weak. So I'm just curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on your thinking about that. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Hi, I just wondered what your thoughts were on the open source model, whether it has a place, if so, how we can use it and promote it.
I think it does, but not by itself. Because one of the problems that we see now is that the companies use, speaking of standards, the companies use open source as a space where they put pieces of their software that then become the de facto standard in the industry. And we've seen this, it's MCP, if I remember, the new API standard that was developed by Anthropic and now was put in open source. It was given to Linux, but it's actually supported by Microsoft, OpenAI, Amazon, Google, you name it. They're all going to use it. It's a different protocol for the AI agents to connect directly with the different sources from which they can extract data or perform tasks. So there is, for instance, a connection with this type of protocol to Slack or to Salesforce solutions. And one can continue, if we expand what this means for the internet, which was supposed to be the big knowledge commons in our society, and where I probably don't have to say to this audience that the emergence of platforms has been a way to enclose the internet, I see the next stage of this to be the use of, for instance, this type of protocols to transform the internet into a place for AI agents and not a place for humans to inform, to contribute, to collaborate, to share, to build communities. So I think that yes, there is a space for open, and all this powered by a protocol that has been put in open source. So I think that yes, there is still, sometimes when I present all this, I do get this also this sense of we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't matter where we look, the solutions that we used to have backfire, so what's to be done? And I think that there, of course, we need open source for public foundation models, open source for other building blocks of the technology. But we also need to rethink about the legal dimension of open source, so that it cannot then be appropriated and used by privates for their own profits. Because open source has a problem, which is that it assumes that everyone is standing on the same platform. There's in economics a term that is absorptive capacities, which basically means that the previous knowledge that you have is essential for enabling you to make sense of the new knowledge. So if I was here speaking Chinese, probably most of you wouldn't understand a word because you don't have the background knowledge needed to understand what I'm saying. So basically, just putting in open source assumes that everyone is on the same page, and those that are at the frontier and control and can make more sense of what's on open source for their own benefit are already the incumbents, the big companies. There is another issue with open source in the way it has been done so far, which is that it seems that there is no directionality. And what is clear from these companies is that they are directing this wave of technological change. So we cannot just assume that knowledge comes out of thin air, it's serendipity, the apple that fell, and then we have generative AI models. We really need to find public ways to define what the priorities should be. And then the model can be put in open source, but I think it also needs to be transformed. And then this, in a way, responds part of the other question about how to do it. I insist that I think that it needs to start by designing an alternative ecosystem that starts from people, the problems, considering planetary boundaries as a main area of concern. And I would advocate for such a solution to be developed internationally. But unfortunately, it's true that the multilateral organizations are not up to the task these days for many reasons. In part, because also these companies are inside these organizations pushing for transformations that benefit them. One example concerns national statistic offices and how the modernization, quote unquote, modernization of national statistic offices, which used to be the main data holders, collectors, and so on, now seems to be becoming subordinate organization to big tech companies because they have the data, they have the indicators, so simply you just have to adopt what they are offering. And companies like Microsoft, IBM, and others have been internally pushing the United Nations to then go and tell the member states that they should be modernizing their national statistic offices through big data, AI, and so on, that of course is offered by these companies. So I know it's complicated, but I'm Argentinian. Clearly, I'm not British, but if you were wondering, where is she from? I'm Argentinian. And there was this experience of a new international economic order that took place around 50 years ago. Countries that thought, hey, the underdeveloped part of the world needs to have a say, needs to work together, needs to think strategically what our priorities are. And today, it's true that, of course, a country like Argentina is different than a country like the UK. But if we want to be very schematic and split between the core of global capitalism and the peripheries, you are now sitting with Argentina. So I think that there is a space outside the US and outside China to think of an alternative that is not, let's work together to win the race. It's more about, if we want to win a race, that needs to be AI for people and the planet, or technology for people and the planet, and putting technology in its place. So again, the planet and the better life for people will not come just with the right technology. They really require political and economic changes.
Thanks, Kenneth from Nation.Asia. And talking about sovereignty, I would just want to understand more about, and has to be touched upon, the concept of decentralized autonomous organization. And in your view, how could AI power DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, in the right direction that is for human and human rights instead of the privileged few?
I think that one of the ways to answer your question is to first start rethinking about AI for what? What's the purpose of AI? For whom? Who develops AI? Who gets access to it? Who understands really how AI works? So we need to democratize also the answers to those questions to start with a solution. And then, unfortunately, we are out of time. So thanks a lot, everyone.